China has ordered the U.S. to close its consulate in Chengdu. It is a response to Tuesday's U.S. directive for China to shut down its consulate in Houston within 72 hours. The latest consulate spat has sent U.S.-China relations into a downward spiral. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said on Thursday that what he calls America's blind engagement policy with China has failed. In his words, the, quote, free world must change China or China will change them. What's behind the Houston decision, and are China-U.S. relations coming apart? What could be done? And to discuss all these issues and more, we're joined by Cheng Xiaohe, Deputy Director of the Center for China's International Strategy Studies at Renmin University of China, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and Martin Seif, Senior Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, and later on by James Andrew Lewis, Senior Vice President and Director of the Technology Policy Program at CSIS based in Washington. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. Welcome. Professor Cheng in Beijing, let me go to you first. Your reaction to China's decision to shut down U.S. consulate in Chengdu. I mean, why Chengdu?
I think you see the United States took the lead to shut down China's consulate in Houston. So you see, I got very surprised, very angry, and I think United States took unprecedented move to close one of the Chinese consulate, and also such a kind of actions was unilateral. So I think it's such a kind of unilateral certainly triggered response from China. China shut down the Chengdu. Chengdu is a sister's consulate with Houston. I think that's match the consulate, Chinese consulate in Houston.
Well, Martin, in Washington, D.C., how do you look at America's decision to close the Chinese consulate in Houston? I mean, they officially accused China of conducting economic espionage and visa fraud. I mean, is that really why?
It is part of the reason, obviously, but I agree with you. There is more to it than this. I think it has to be seen in the political context. The president is not doing well in opinion polls against former Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate against him in November. And the president wants to build up his base. He wants to get all his base supporters in the heartland out. And he campaigned in 2016 in a very hostile China-bashing policy. Now, sometimes he followed that as president. At other times, he has taken a much more pragmatic and realistic tone. But I very much fear, at the very minimum, we are going to see this relationship continue to deteriorate until the presidential election. But there is another, I think, much more dangerous aspect that came through very strongly in the Secretary of State's speech yesterday. It was a triumphalist speech. It basically said there is no room anymore for tolerance in American foreign policy. We are not prepared to look to coexist in the long term with China. And they never took this tone before. They never took this tone in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which was a much more threatening military confrontation than any of the arguments the U.S. has had with China. There is a strange, irrational triumphalism here, and I think it is potentially very harmful.
Well, Jeffrey, what's your best guess on the decision-making process of the Trump administration to close down a Chinese consulate? I mean, this is an unprecedented move. Who do you think drove the decision? Was it the state, the FBI, or, how much was Trump himself involved in all this?
I think it's really important for China just to remain calm until the November election. Trump is a failed president in a failed administration. He is surrounded by extremists like Pompeo, who ideologically is an American exceptionalist of a very extreme variety. So I regard the actions by this administration as consistently wrong-headed and irrational. But we have an election coming up in November, and I very much hope that Trump is defeated because he's a disaster for the United States people. We have an out-of-control epidemic. He's been a disaster for the economy. And I hope that he is defeated and we have a chance for more rational policy. But I don't regard this as rational, and it's very hard for me to know the decision-making process inside such an unstable government.
Well, yeah, it is the guest of everybody. Let's look at some reaction online. People are, of course, debating about why the U.S. has done this. This friend, Mrs. Karasen Sting, said Trump is literally starting a diplomatic war with China by closing the Chinese consulate in Houston, just so he can demonize China more over COVID-19. He apparently believes that if he makes China the enemy, people will more likely believe that COVID-19 is entirely on them. Jeffrey, I want to stay with you. To what extent do you think that is true?
Well, there are many different strands of thinking here. As I said, Pompeo himself is a radical American exceptionalist, a Christian evangelical who believes that it's God's providence that America rules the world. It's very strange people. Trump himself is a really despicable, lying, incompetent person who has left the United States open to this terrible epidemic that his incompetence has caused mass deaths in the United States. So we really have an unstable situation, and Trump, behind in the polls, is taking desperate actions. This is not real strategy. Of course, there is a strain in American foreign policy that is anti-China because American exceptionalism. And so this is also part of the milieu. But I would say that it's especially the chaos of this Trump administration in its final months trying to do anything to win re-election. And I think the point that was made to stir up the heartland of evangelical voters through China bashing is definitely part of this. For the moment, it's very unfortunate. I think the point is to remain very calm and have an election in November. I hope that this administration gets defeated because it deserves to be defeated.
I basically agree with Professor Sachs' opinions. And what Trump administration have done is not a strategy, it's a tactic. And in addition to the domestic considerations that Trump desperately tried to secure its re-elections. And I think there's another thing we have to look at, because you see the relationship between China and the United States has been worse so significantly. It is outgrowth of the worsening relationship and the closures of the consulates on both sides. I think that's the very natural result of such a kind of deteriorations on bilateral relations between China and the United States. And China, in the past 2 years, China and the United States has been fighting over trade, technologies, and other hot issues like South China Seas, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. And it's very natural, such a kind of fight spread into the field of diplomatic missions.
Right. Martin in Washington, you've followed U.S.-Russia relations actually for a long time. In 2017, the U.S. forced closure of Russia's San Francisco consulate and 2 of its other foreign missions in New York and Washington. If the U.S.-Russian diplomatic incident was of any reference, what do you think will happen to the current U.S.-China episode?
A very good point. the Russian episode is sobering. Trump had a good personal relationship with President Putin, but President Putin has repeatedly expressed his frank opinion that even if Trump wanted to improve relations with Moscow, he would not be allowed to do so, that the momentum in Congress and in the U.S. deep state is hostile to such positive developments. And I think here it's a worse situation for the very reason that Professor Sachs rightly pointed out. We do have an anti-China obsession. There is a common view, a much too common view, that that in fact was the undertone and backbone of Pompeo's speech yesterday, that the United States is doomed to, or fated to have some full 21st century non-stop confrontation with China. Now, this is not rational, as Professor Sachs said. It is nonsense. It is not a guide to any kind of sane policy making at all. But Pompeo is locked into this view. It looks increasingly likely that O'Brien, the current national security advisor, is following along in his wake, and the president seems to be increasingly embracing it himself. The problem is, again, how much more damage will be done before the next presidential inauguration in January.
Martin, you talked about Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech. Many called it the new Iron Curtain speech. He says U.S. engagement with China has failed and called on the free world to join Washington to rewrite the imbalances that have grown over the decades. I want you to listen to what Pompeo said.
Maybe it's time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies. We have the tools. I know we can do it.
Martin, do you think this is the new Iron Curtain speech of some sort?
He wants it to be. I think it will be a disastrous failure because there was a major difference. And that is, in 1947, the nations of Western Europe were exhausted. They could not stand as free actors. They were dependent on the United States. And NATO was presented to them as a defensive alliance. Here, instead, we have this new alliance, which is already explicitly an aggressive alliance that is not merely to allegedly protect other nations against China, but is an action of aggression against China. Pompeo made this clear in the speech. He said the United States and its allies could not rest until they had changed internal conditions in China. Now, what would the U.S. reaction be if any Chinese or Russian leader said, we cannot rest until we change the very structure of American society? There would be outrage across the United States. And yet they cannot see that this is what they are attempting to do themselves. So this is not remotely comparable to 1947. And of course, Russia will not come in with the United States, as Pompeo very clumsily and absurdly thought he was inviting them to do, because Russia has been repeatedly penalized by this administration and by much more by the Congress, both sides of Congress, since 2014. Since the coup that toppled a democratic government in Ukraine, which was backed by the U.S. and NATO. So this is not remotely comparable to 1947, however much Pompeo imagines that it is.
Well, thank you so much for this historical perspective, Martin. Jeffrey, let me go to you. Pompeo said that he stands with the Chinese people, though in the same speech, he, of course, accused the Party of China of conducting espionage, infiltrating U.S. society, launching influence campaigns, intellectual property. We're all too familiar with those rhetorics. How do you look at the fact that this Trump administration is now separating the ruling Party of China from its people?
Well, I think what Martin said is right. In Pompeo's mind, this is 1947. And in Pompeo's mind, this is another American crusade. It's extraordinarily naive. It is not the view of the rest of the world. Of course, if Trump remains in power, it's a real danger. I would not discount that. I think it is very important for the United States and for the world that Trump is defeated in November, because he is governing a very chaotic, very irresponsible, very delusional government that is resulting in mass deaths in the United States and a lot of instability internationally. But it is a kind of playbook of American exceptionalism. And Pompeo is a very naive, simple man who is thumping his chest, and I don't think it goes very far, except if Trump is reelected, then the world is going to be unstable. This is the fact of the matter. If he is defeated, this speech will only be read by students in obscure footnotes in the future. It has no reality other than if this group remains in power in the United States.
Professor Cheng, how do you look at Mike Pompeo's speech yesterday?
Me?
Do you have Professor Cheng?
Oh, yes. I just want to add one point to the comments made by second. I think it's we have to realize the connections between the Communist Party and the Chinese peoples. In China, as a ruling party, the CCPP has 90 million members with the connections of million Chinese families. So punish the Communist CCP's members could be perceived by many Chinese as the punishment of the whole Chinese people. So that will push more and more Chinese to the pool of anti-Americanists. So that's one point I would add. But move to the speech made by Pompeo. I think that speech is very important. Even though such a kind of speech is full of rhetoric, but the rhetoric sometimes bites. And I think there's a number of things we have to pay special attention. Number one is Pompeo's speech is only one of the 4 major speeches made by the senior U.S. officials. And this Pompeo speech is the complete, most comprehensive one. And the second, Pompeo's speech basically portrays China as a new tyranny, and also try to based China's United States relations on one principle. The principle is so-called distrust and verify. And in other words, Pompeo's speech and the United States government began to perceive China as another Soviet Union. I think the so-called distrust and verifies approach, such a kind of approach basically would make China and the United States more difficulty to handle and make two countries more difficulty to start negotiations. Because if the United States doesn't trust China, if China doesn't trust the United States, how the two countries could engage in a serious and meaningful negotiations? So without trust, how the two countries could move forward to reach the next goals?
Right. Hopefully your advice will be heeded by Washington. Martin, my friend, let me go to you. I want to talk about, the American public, the popular opinion. Do you think is this current free fall in U.S.-China relations what the American general public want to see? I mean, are there channels they can influence foreign policy decision-making at this point?
I think there are indeed such channels, but I don't think the public has alerted to them. The problem here is that China is being scapegoated for the failure of the Trump administration to have a sensible testing policy nationally and sensible quarantine policies imposed urged more vigorously on state and city governments across the country. China is on the receiving end of this, and therefore This has not produced any serious racist, broad-scale anti-Chinese bigotry so far across the country, thankfully. But I think it does have the sense of muting outrage at the failures and bungles of the Trump administration. At least this is what they are trying to do. They are trying to transmute, as Professor Sachs said, their record of miserable failure, especially on the. I am more positive on them on their economic policies, but there's no question they have totally disastrously bungled these policies on the pandemic, and they want a scapegoat for it. And history shows us that when governments fail to produce any protection for their public from health crises such as the Black Death in the Middle Ages, or in today, this pandemic, then the public becomes irrational, and sometimes demagogues seek to direct them towards a scapegoat. And that's what they're trying to do with China. And again, it is a very dangerous and stupid and totally irrational and destructive policy. And the sooner we see an end of it, the better.
Professor Cheng, many say that the current down spiral, as Martin has specified, is more of a product of political manipulation than an organic interaction. Do you think there is anything that we can do, we can go about dealing with this from now until the November election?
I think, as you see, the current situations on China and the United States certainly is very disappointed, and also is very dangerous at the moment. Yes. I think certainly it has something to do with the political manipulations, and also have something to do with the United States domestic situations, particularly the presidential elections, and we discussed this a lot earlier on. And I think it's it's getting tough. Nonetheless, getting tough with China become something supported by both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and from now on, such a kind of elections will play very, very negative roles on the United States policy toward China. And one thing for sure is, no matter who's going to win the November's presidential elections, no matter it's Democratic Biden or Republican Trump, getting tough with China will be a sure policies of the next American administrations.
All right, we understand that we now have James Andrew Lewis, Senior Vice President and Director of the Technology Policy Program at CSIS. James, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much.
You are in Washington. Can you try to help us understand the decision-making process of Washington? Why they chose to close the Chinese consulate in Houston, and why now?
I think that the administration, and particularly the Department of Justice, has decided to launch an initiative against what they see as Chinese espionage. And this is the first step. They tell me there will be additional steps. So you've seen a series of indictments and speeches, and now the closing of the consulate. They tell me there will be more.
So there will be more. Are you in a position to specify what are those more?
No, they haven't told me, but I think it will be more, probably indictments, more arrests of individuals if they're caught carrying information that they've stolen. So that's a guess, though. I mean, I think the only thing I've heard is more indictments.
But the timing of all this is tricky, right? Many of the things that the Justice Department, the FBI, the administration accused China of doing have been around for years, if not decades.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. And so, of course, people wonder if there's a connection to the election. I don't think that's so, but you can never tell with this White House. But at the Justice Department, at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, this has been a long-standing program that they've had underway for several months. But of course, it will become part of the election as we move forward.
So what do you think will happen, after the November election? Do you think the current FBI, Justice Department decisions to go against China is a cross agency effort, or is it largely driven by Trump and his electoral political decisions?
Unfortunately, I think it's now a consensus in Washington, and I've seen some of the Biden policy documents that suggest a continuation of this policy, albeit in a smoother manner. So whether it's Trump or Biden, and right now no one is taking any bets in Washington as to who's going to win. It's very close, but it doesn't make any difference because I think there will still be increased confrontation with China, no matter who's in the White House.
I mean, one last question, James, before I move on to other guests. I mean, is the Trump administration concerned at all about China's retaliation? We saw that Beijing asked the U.S. Consulate in Chengdu to close.
I've talked to them about that, and in thinking about taking some of these actions some months ago, several of us raised the point of you need to think about Chinese retaliation. I don't think they care. They'll listen to the business community, which is concerned, but honestly, it doesn't appear to factor into their decisions.
What about the American people? I mean, do you think their, policies, efforts against China is a reflection of the people they're representing?
Yes, I would say that the survey data here shows a vast change in people's attitudes towards China over the last 2 or 3 years, really since 2015. So this probably does reflect the sentiments of most Americans. They don't have a good idea what to do, but all of them support this kind of action.
Well, Martin in Washington, D.C., have you just heard what James said, and do you want to comment on what James said?
I think James hit the nail on the head. I would love to disagree because his assessment is a very sobering and pessimistic assessment, but I think he is absolutely right. There is a bipartisan attitude here. And again, I think underlying this is something that does go back to the Cold War. There is a nostalgia now, and I am old enough to remember the Cold War. People did not want it at the time. They were much more adult about the dangers of nuclear confrontation or conflict breaking out because there was tension between major powers. That additional sense of responsibility is something we miss. But the attitude then was, let us reduce tensions with the Soviet Union. And that was an attitude of consensus across the American people and both political parties. Today, as James says, the Democrats share the attitude of China bashing that is developing among Republicans. It's irrational, it's unfair, as Professor Sachs rightly said before. It is no substitute for sane and rational policy making. But instead of the Democrats...
Martin, I'm sorry, but I have to let you go, and that's all the time we have.
Along with it.
We'll discuss next time around. Thank you so much to all my guests, and that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.